So I just read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or A Modern Prometheus. Although I feel like Frankenstein's much more of an Icarus than a Prometheus, but I guess he's a bit of both. One of the fascinating things about this book is that it was written by an 18-year-old. Mary Shelley, although she wasn't married to Shelley at the time, wrote it while on holiday, a rainy summer in Switzerland with Byron and Shelley. And I don't know, there's so many parts of this book that it doesn't feel like someone who's 18, basically a child, could write. Sort of a knowledge and a wisdom that, I mean, it's not, I don't know, it just really blows my mind that someone that at 18 can write this. Now, if you haven't read Frankenstein before, like myself, this was my first time reading it, it's quite a bit different than the sort of popular idea of Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster. So it takes place in the 1700s, and it starts with this man, Robert Walton, who's writing letters to his sister, telling her about his sort of journey. He's heading to the North Pole. He's going to explore the North Pole, the magnetic North Pole, find out what's going on up there because no one's been up there yet. And so this story is in the form of these letters that he's writing back to his sister. Now, on his way up north, he goes through Archangel and Russia and heading out into the Northern Sea, and he sees a very, very large man, it appears, in a sleigh traveling on ice. And their ship gets trapped in the ice, and then they find another man in another dog sled calling for help, and they take him aboard, but not before he asks, like, where are you going? Are you going back south to safety, or you're continuing north? And they say, we're continuing north. He says, okay, well then I'll go with you. So it's like, why would this guy want to go with them if they're going deeper into the ice? But it's revealed that he's chasing after this man they had seen earlier. And this man reveals to Robert Walton that he is Victor Frankenstein, and relates the entirety of Frankenstein's story to Robert Walton, who's then transcribing it and sending it as letters to his sister Margaret, which is the form of the book that we have. So Frankenstein starts the story talking about how he was a young man, he's very bright, really into science, and wanted to sort of study and learn more about the world, which he cautions Robert Walton. So Walton wants to go up and explore the North Pole, and he sort of warns him about hubris and about sort of reaching farther than you can. Sort of, like I said, a very Icarus story. But Frankenstein was just like this when he was a kid, or when he was younger. Frankenstein's from Geneva in Switzerland. He came from a pretty good family. His family adopted this young girl who had been an orphan, and she was sort of raised as his sister, but not really a sister because they were kind of set up to be married. She's very beautiful, very talented woman named Elizabeth. He also had two younger brothers, William and Ernest. His mother died when he was quite young, but they had a number of servants. One of them's this girl named Justine, who was also very nice and looked after Frankenstein's mother while she was dying. But, you know, he's a young man. He wants to learn about the world and about science and whatnot. So he goes off to Germany, to this town, Ingolstadt. And that's where he starts studying. And he talks about how he was really into the sort of the occult, so these sort of weird, esoteric, old philosophers that modern science thinks of as jokes, but for whatever reason he was really into that. And throughout his studies he eventually discovers a way to sort of reanimate corpses, and he thinks, like, what am I going to do with this power? Well, instead of sort of working my way up from like an animal to whatever, he goes straight to creating a human being. So using parts of cadavers and bodies, he stitches together this monstrosity, this 8-foot tall, massive, burly man, and imbues it with life. Now, it's never described how that works. I don't know if it's just the popular culture imagination in my head of lightning being involved, but he does mention a story where he sees a tree get struck by lightning, and that's sort of his inspiration for him. Anyways, he's created this creature who's never named, and I think that's part of the story. Like, if this creature had been given a name, perhaps things would have turned out differently. A name could have came with it a measure of humanity, but it's only ever referred to as the wretch, the monster, the abomination, the demon. And so Frankenstein witnesses this monster open its eyes and come to life, and he flees from it, is repulsed by it, is disgusted by it, horrified by it, and sort of runs away, and the monster manages to escape. And he's really shook up about this, Frankenstein is, but he manages to, he gets kind of sick and spends the winter being looked after by his friend, Henry Clavel, or I almost said Henry Cavill. Henry Clerval. We'll call him Henry Cavill. Henry, who comes in and looks after him, is like best friend. And then they get news that Frankenstein's younger brother, William, who's just a kid, has been murdered. And so he's really shocked. They head back to Geneva, and Frankenstein discovers that William had been killed by this monster that he created. And what's worse is that William had this portrait of his mother on him, and they found the portrait inside the dress of Justine, the servant. So all signs point to Justine being the murderer, although no one really believes it's her. They all protest her innocence. And of course, Frankenstein Victor, most of all, believes that he knows that it's this monster he created that had killed William. But because the justice system being what it is, they sentence Justine to death, and she eventually confesses, a false confession, because of the pressure that's been put on her, and they sort of threaten her immortal soul, and they say that they won't give her confession if she doesn't confess. So she does confess and then is executed. So both his younger brother and this innocent young servant girl are killed. And Victor Frankenstein really takes this to heart. He believes that he's sort of the murderer, he's the perpetrator, because of the creation of this monster that had murdered these kids. And this really starts his depression and almost spiral to insanity, and the start of the horror of this novel. So Frankenstein goes out, and there's lots of very picturesque scenes and descriptions of the mountains and the glaciers of Switzerland, and the valleys and the lakes and whatnot. He goes out and encounters the monster, and the monster says, "Hey, listen, hear me out. I want to tell you my story, and then I'll ask you something, and then we can go from there." And Frankenstein's horrified. He's disgusted. He hates this creature for the murder that it caused. But the monster's like, "No, hear me out. Look, you can't lose anything by listening to me, so let me tell you my story." So then our story within a story goes into another story, and we have the monster itself revealing from its perspective what has happened. So it talks about coming to, and it's sort of gaining consciousness and only being able to feel certain sensations of heat and cold and light and dark, pain and comfort and whatnot. And it's a really neat description of sort of from birth to childhood to gaining understanding, sort of growing up, but it's all done through this fully formed body. The monster describes how it managed to survive and escape, and eventually moves into this sort of hovel that has sort of cracks in the wood where it can look into the house that it adjoins. And within that house is this family, this French family, and the monster learns everything from this family, learns how to speak French, learns how to read, learns history, geography, and whatnot. Part of that's because there's sort of a mini story about this family, this guy Felix and his blind father and his sister, and they're quite downcast, and it seems like something's going wrong. And the monster helps them out and will sort of cut firewood for them and leave it for them so that Felix has time to do other things, and they sort of think it's some spirit that they're very grateful for that is helping them out. But of course the monster realizes he looks repulsive and so does not reveal himself. But this beautiful woman comes to the door one time, and then everything seems to be happy. And it's later revealed that there's a whole backstory about this Turkish merchant in Paris who was arrested, but he was really innocent. So then Felix tried to free him and managed to get him to escape, and the man promised his daughter, but then the man reneged on his deal. And then in Paris they found out that Felix did this, and so they exiled his whole family. So the family had been waiting for this daughter to arrive. The daughter finally arrives, and because she's they describe her as Arabic, she's Turkic. She can't speak French, so they have to teach her French, and that's how the monster learns French. Anyways, that's sort of his education. He manages to learn a whole bunch of stuff, and he seems like a nice guy at this point. Like, he's just sort of a kid. He's learning things. He's helping out when he can. He seems to have the capacity for good, but he's really lonely. So he's like, I have to introduce myself to this family. The father was blind, so when the father's alone one day, the monster goes in and introduces himself to the father, and the father seems really nice and says like, yeah, sure, I'll help you out. But then when the rest of the family come, they see this massive, grotesque monster near their father, and they attack him. And he says that the monster reveals that he was strong enough, he could have killed them all with his bare hands, but he fled. And then there's a scene where he's in the forest, and he sees this young girl, I think it is, who falls into a river, and he manages to get in and save her from drowning. But just as he saves her, her father, someone comes along and sees her with this monster and sort of attacks the monster and takes the daughter away. And he's like, look, I'm just trying to help. I'm doing nice things. Why is everybody attacking me? And he starts to curse his sort of maker, and he finds some letters in his jacket that he had stolen when he fled the laboratory, and the letters reveal that sort of creator is this man Frankenstein, because he can now read French. And so he starts to sort of plot vengeance on his creator for creating him and abandoning him and leaving him alone in a world where everyone hates him. And so he's heading to Geneva, to Switzerland, because he knows that's where Frankenstein's from. He comes across this boy who the boy reveals himself to be William Frankenstein, his Victor's younger brother. And so the monster, in a fit of rage, strangles the boy, takes the picture from his neck and puts it in the dress of the girl Justine. And we saw how that turned out. So this is all revealed to Victor, to Frankenstein, who sort of knew all of this. But the monster then says, hey, I need you to create a female for me, a sort of a companion. I'm all alone. If you can make one more person, then I will leave humanity alone. We'll live in the wilderness, and we will never bother anyone again. And at first, Frankenstein's like, there's no way, like the evil that you've already done, I'm not bringing another one into this world. But he eventually relents and thinks like, if I'm responsible for this creation, I need to take that responsibility, and I need to do what I can to sort of make things right. Even though this thing killed his brother and had this servant girl killed. But yeah, there's very much a sort of a themes of a god abandoning its creations, and what do the creations owe to the god, and what does the god owe to the creations, which is really an interesting theme. So Frankenstein agrees that he's going to do this, and he's distraught, he's melancholy, he's worried, like, is the rest of his family in danger? How is he going to do this? But eventually he sort of thinks about these philosophers in England, and he needs to go talk to them, and they will sort of help him out. And then he'll be somewhere really isolated, and he can create this female companion. And so he travels to England. Henry Clerval goes with him, his best friend, as Henry's got these plans that he wants to go off. He's been studying Eastern languages. He wants to go off to India and help with the colonization there. And they're in England, and then they get a message from someone in Scotland saying, hey, you should come hang out. So they agree and go up to Scotland, and this is when Frankenstein's like, hey, Clerval, I'm going to go off on my own for a bit. I just need some time. I'll come back when I'm done. And so he goes up to the northern, Orkney Islands, and in the most isolated northern part of the British Isles, he starts creating this female companion. But then one day he sees the monster who has been following him this whole time. It gave me very sort of Gollum, Lord of the Rings vibes. Gollum tracking the Fellowship. This is this monster tracking Frankenstein. They're up in the north on this island, and the monster appears, and Frankenstein sort of breaks, and he realizes what he's doing, and so he, right in front of the monster, he starts hacking and cutting and destroying this companion that he had been creating, and tearing it to pieces. And so the monster swears vengeance and says, like, I'll be there on your wedding night, because it's all set up that by the time Frankenstein gets back to Switzerland, he's going to finally marry Elizabeth. And Frankenstein's really upset, but he's like, I can't bring more evil into this world. There's no way. It's kind of feminist in a way. It's like, if I create this woman, there's no way to guarantee that she's going to sort of obey the first monster, her sort of husband, and do whatever he promised. She could go off and perform all kinds of mischief and murder on her own. Anyway, so he goes out in a boat into the ocean and puts the remains of this corpse that he had been building into these baskets full of stones and throw them into the ocean. But then he gets blown off course, and he ends up washing up on, or not washing up, but he ends up lost at sea for a bit, and then ends up at a port in Ireland, and doesn't realize where he is. He thinks he's still in England, but when he gets there, he's immediately arrested. He's like, why are you arresting me? They're like, well, because you murdered someone. He's like, what are you talking about? I just got here. And they reveal that they had found this corpse in the woods. And when they found it, they saw a boat with a single man in it leaving shore. So it looks like the body was dumped, and then the boat went away. And they said the corpse had been killed by strangulation. And that sort of triggers his memory of his younger brother and the monster that had done it. And so he's sort of visibly shaken, and they sort of see this as a hint of guilt. And so they take him to the body, and it turns out to be Henry Clerval, his best friend, who of course had been killed by the monster. And he's super distraught and breaks down and loses his mind and claims that he's the one who killed him, because he still thinks that he, in creating this monster, is responsible for the deaths that the monster has caused. And so they take this to mean an admission of guilt, and he's sort of locked up for a while. But like I said, he's lost his mind, he's insensate, and so the story sort of jumps ahead a bit to when he sort of comes to. And his father shows up, and it's revealed that there's evidence that he had been in Orkney at the time that the murder happened, so there's no way it could be him. And then he's taken back to Switzerland, and he doesn't know what to do. He's thinking, like the monster said, he'll be there on my wedding night. So he's assuming that he'll be killed on his wedding night. But he's like, no, there's no sense in putting it off. Let me just get through this. And so he goes ahead with the wedding. But he's got a gun and some knives and stuff, and he's ready for this monster to attack him. But of course, the monster attacks and kills Elizabeth, his now wife. And again, he's super distraught. He tries to chase down the monster. This is when he finally goes to the authorities and tells them, like, hey, there's this monster on the loose. I know it sounds crazy, and they sort of do think he's crazy, but he's like, there is this monster we're going to deal with. His father, because of all the suffering that his father went through, I mean, Elizabeth was almost a daughter to him. His father is old and sort of passes away not much longer after Elizabeth does. And again, Frankenstein has this period of time where he's totally insane and has to be put in sort of a hospital and looked after for a bit. He sort of has no one at this point. Everyone's been taken away from him. And when he finally comes to, he swears vengeance against this monster and plots that he will never rest until the monster has been killed. And so he hunts him down. And this final segment of the book is sort of this great chase where the monster is sort of leading him on, providing him food and hints, and literally leading him on a wild goose chase. And they end up in the far north in Russia, and then they take off on these dog sleds across the ice, and that's when Frankenstein bumps into Robert Walton. Sort of closes off our story of all the horrors that had befallen Frankenstein and his family because of the creation of this monster. And so we enter the final few chapters of the story where Robert still has this urge to get to the North Pole, and this sort of this hubris and this drive for discovery and knowledge, similar to Frankenstein. But his men come to him and say, like, we're not mutinying, but they're currently frozen in the ice, by the way, but when the ice thaws, let's head south while we can instead of trying to get further north. And Frankenstein sort of comes to at this point. He's really sick and dying, but he says, like, are you not men of courage? He gives them a big speech trying to convince them to keep pressing on, which you'd think he'd realize the dangers of hubris at this point. But anyways, when the ice does thaw, Walton decides to turn back and head south to England. But the sort of final letter that he's writing to Margaret, he reveals that Frankenstein dies. And as he's writing this, the sort of letter and talking about how Frankenstein had passed away, he's sort of like, what is this? I hear some noise in the next room. And then the next paragraph is, you will never believe what happened. I just went over to the next room and the monster was there. So the monster has sort of climbed in through the window and stood over the corpse of its creator over Frankenstein and told its story about how, yes, it made Frankenstein suffer, but Frankenstein had made it suffer more, and its very existence is suffering, and so now it's going to go to the North Pole and then burn itself to death so that its ashes will be scattered to the four winds and no one will ever find it. And then only then will its pain be ended. And that's how the story ends. So yeah, much different than sort of the cartoony version of Frankenstein that I had in my head. Really good, really sort of gothic horror. Horror in the sense of these horrible things happening to someone over and over and over again because of hubris, ultimately. Like I said, very Icarus. He tried to be a Prometheus and ended up being an Icarus. He flew too close to the sun and it burned him. Still quite a romantic novel in terms of the descriptions of these beautiful countrysides and these it was written in very, very early 19th century, but I think it still has that sort of romantic element to it. But it is pretty dark, really, really well written though for an 18-year-old. That blows my mind. So it's a novel about vengeance, about hubris, about sort of the relationship between a creator and its creation. Could be a parent and child, could be a god and man. The sort of futility of vengeance, I guess, would be part of it. I know there's a lot to it. It's not a very long book. It's like 200 and something pages. But anyways, that's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.